Okay, we are beginning with a short prayer. Father, we ask your blessing on people throughout the world who are suffering today, particularly people suffering the effects of weather in different places of the world, and principally in California and the storms on the East Coast. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. What we're talking about now is a movement in the 1800s that was very, very important to the church and very good for the church, actually. And this movement was called Romanticism. And remember, Romanticism was sort of added to Enlightenment. And Enlightenment was purely logical, mental, and everything. And Romanticism caused people to look at the other side of things, look at deeper mystical things like that as well. So anyway, and this really began in Germany. One of the early ones is a man by the name of Hegel. Hegel was a German poet, and he wrote that the spirit split into opposites, reshaping itself again and again on higher levels till arriving at a state of absolute knowing. Okay? So he maintains, and by the Spirit, not the Holy Ghost, but the spirit of a society sort of splits into opposites and then rejoins on a higher level, splits into opposites, rejoins. And an example right now, we would see the United States split into opposites. Okay? And Hegel would say, now that's going to join together, picking up elements from both sides that are good to move on. And lest you think that's kind of strange, if you were to go back to the American Revolution when our country was founded, we were split into opposites. There were royalists and there were the revolutionaries. And they were both very strong and had very good reasons why they were loyal to the king and why they wanted independence from the king. Both those things existed, but they went together to mold the United States. And then you'll watch the United States split over slavery. And we had the Civil War over that one, but when the thing came over. But so it is a process in society. It's interesting. I had a classmate in Berkeley when I was studying there who maintained the same process takes place in everyone's personality. He says that your personality is sort of defined, let's say, and you get a brand new idea, and you sort of divide between the defense of the new idea and the defense of what it's replacing, and then you come to a whole synthesis again. Anyway, this process is defined as thesis, which is a proposition. Let's say the proposition being the king is good, strong leadership, okay? And it clashes with its opposite, which of course is called antithesis, which is the king is bad, okay? And creates a synthesis, which is a union of both positions. And what was the union of both positions? We ended up with a very strong leadership, but the strong leadership was not vested in a person. It was vested in the checks and balances that we call American government, okay? So we had this really strong leadership of the king, and then people who did not like the strong leadership of the king, we ended up with strong leadership, but of the people, not the king, okay? So he maintained that goes on. Many people believe that the Enlightenment and Romanticism together have done more to shape modern thinking than anything else in the entire world, that our way of thinking has been really shaped by these movements. One outgrowth of this movement was a great renewal of interest in religion, in social work, and in history. Now remember, the intellectuals, as we saw the the first movement of the Enlightenment, that they saw things purely, they would analyze what it was. It would be like you and I would analyze, let's say, what's involved in photography. And we would analyze and know and everything, the photography. But a whole other element of photography is how photography plays as a result of painting. Like if you study the history of photography, you'll notice that the earliest photographs are divided actually into two groups. One group that you and I are more familiar with because they're used a lot in books are historical things. So they would photograph new things and this sort of stuff. But you know, there were as many photographs produced at that time, they're actually imitation of paintings. People having the same poses, the same dresses and everything of these very famous paintings. And photography was seen kind of as a replacement for painting. Now, it has developed and everything into its own art, but this idea of the Romanticism is to be able to look at a photograph, and not just as a photograph now, but as the history and everything behind it. And I tell you personally, one of the strongest things, history is very important to me, the study of it, but I would say history has been probably the most important element that has kept me within the Catholic Church. Because there's certain movements that I see outside that are really good movements, and there's certain, but for me, one of the things I see in the Catholic Church, it is the only community on the face of the earth can reach back and historically lay hands on Jesus Christ. It is that identified, and that's history, you know. But that's, you look at the Catholic Church today, and I see it in these layers of history. So to look at it today is sort of the Enlightenment thing. They have these layers of history, is the Romanticism, okay? And they play in everything we do. As we mentioned, they're very, very powerful things. And this brought a great renewed interest in religion everywhere. Many intellectuals joined the church as a result of these studies, and there was a growing interest in the mystery of faith. An example would be someone has faith, they believe, they have these beliefs, they have faith, and this sort of thing. That the mystery of faith is why someone has it and someone doesn't, and stuff. I've mentioned this in talks before, but something I very often meditate on. There are people much brighter than me who do not believe. There are people much brighter than me who do believe. There are people much less bright than I who do believe, and there are people much less bright than I that don't believe. So obviously belief isn't founded on how bright you are. So what does it come from? Because belief is analyzing truths and all these things. So where does it come from? That's the mystery element of faith. There is a mystery element to all these things. And if you're, again, a student of writing, the mystery element is what makes poetry. Poetry plays with the mystery element and everything. There was a man by the name of Hofbauer, and he came from a very poor Czech family and was financed through his education and went to Rome, and he eventually joined the Redemptorists, okay? So friends and people financed him through his education. He was obviously a very brilliant man. And then he went on to further studies in Rome and joined the Redemptorist Society. He was not allowed to start the Redemptorists in Austria because at that time there were very anti-Catholic laws. Remember, Austria was connected with Germany, and so there were very strong anti-Catholic laws. So he worked in Poland for many years and then finally returned to Vienna, Austria. He was not a great speaker, but the power of his message drew many back to the church. When you think of a speaker in religion, and this is probably true in other areas too, but if you think of a speaker in religion, the ability to give a good presentation and speak is one thing. The ability to understand and know something is another. And I would venture, if you saw I'm thinking of that, a science program that today is Odyssey. I forget what it was originally. But the guy who gives the science presentation gives a very deep, profound science, but it is so easy to watch. and so easy to understand. And what he's talking about is a very, very difficult subject. Now, I have been in college to many professors who really understood their topic, but were not good speakers. That's kind of a common thing. And I think oftentimes when we talk about politicians and people in the news media, oftentimes you encounter very good speakers who don't understand what they're talking about. So those are two very, very different things. This man was not an excellent speaker, but he really understood what he was about, and he drew many people back to the church. Schlegel was a man who taught the history of religion at the University of Vienna. And one of the things he did was point out how much European culture owed to the church. And remember, at this time they were intellectual and were moving away from the church and everything. And what he said is the church permeates kind of everything we do. He was originally from Cologne, and his wife and he both became Catholics while they were in Vienna. He became very close friends with his Hofbauer we mentioned earlier, and together they worked for economic growth of the poor. So we see a rise in this social care for the poor as well. To give you an example of this from my own life, when I began to study visit Rome and study a lot about Roman architecture, I was never too interested in it before I went to Rome. But when I began to study it, our church has been formed by Roman architecture. And the thing is, when we as a church started temples to gods, had nothing in them but the statue of the god. You want to see a good example of Roman and Greek temples in Washington, D.C. You go to the Lincoln Memorial, the only thing inside it's the statue of Lincoln. You go to the Jefferson Memorial, the only thing inside of it's a statue of Jefferson. And things that would take place, like celebrations, would take place on the mall in front of the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, stuff like that. But the only thing in it was a statue of the god. So when we became a religion and began to grow, we weren't going to build a temple. We didn't want a building with a statue of Jesus in it. That's not what we want. So, we did not take over the religious thing out of Rome. We took over the political thing. And what we took over was basilicas. And the basilica was the throne room of the emperor. All the stuff set to a throne in the center. And if you look at that, we've been formed as a church by that, so that like if an architect decides to design a church, after Vatican II, there were a lot of circular churches. They've kind of gotten away from that. But the thing is, if you've been raised in a church like this, it's very difficult to think in another shaped church. So we've been very formed by Roman architecture that had nothing to do with religion, not the religious Roman architecture, but just regular Roman architecture. Liberalism was another important movement in this period. Understand that liberalism and conservatism have always existed, okay? They're liberals and conservatives. But liberalism is here defined as a movement, and it began. It emphasized progress and freedom. Now, it would be logical to begin at this time. We're talking in the 1800s. There's so many new inventions, so much being found out about science, all kinds of things like that. And so this emphasized progress and the freedom to try new things. Like if you look in the church, at one time, and I think this is the time, the only instrument you could play in the church was an organ. I think many of us remember that if someone said playing a guitar, we would think of it in a hootenanny or a bar or something. It would never occur to us in a church. And yet those things came in, okay? But the idea is there are a lot of interesting things coming in, and then do we partake of them or not? So liberalism said we try them. Another thing of the liberals is they hated the privileges of upper classes and the corruption and inefficiency of the old regimes. One of the things about liberals is they really don't like class distinctions, okay, that oftentimes lead to certain kind of privilege. I'll tell you something that drives me crazy, and most people will think this is unimportant and baloney, but I know several policemen, and every one of them carries their badge with them all the time, and their badge is in their wallet opposite their driver's license. And the reason it's there is if they're ever stopped for speeding, the first thing the policeman notices is their shield, and they get off. So they have the privilege of doing what I always wanted to do, which was speed with immunity. Okay? They can do that. Okay? And that's why they do that. That galls me. Is it a good thing? No. Is it important? I don't think it's probably very important. It just galls me. Okay? So they wanted all people equal before the law, and they wanted people's participation in constitutional rule. Okay? So our country actually grew out of this liberal movement. They wanted as much freedom as possible in writing and speaking. Okay? So that it used to be, if you were to go back into England, you say something negative about the king, you can be killed. Okay? You did not do that sort of thing. And writing and speaking, you had to be very, very careful about what was done. But if you remember the United States, we were founded largely because of speakers and publications under people like Benjamin Franklin that spread the possibility of the revolution through the colonies. So they were very much in favor of this. But notice as much freedom as possible. You know, we're going through a fight for this today, and this endlessly goes on. Things like Facebook and stuff. Can they print a lie? Okay? I had a woman come up to me the other day and told me about some outrageous thing that took place in the church. And it just sounded insane to me. I have no reason to even suspect it might be true. But she says, and she wanted me to look at it on the internet. And I said, no, I didn't want to be bothered. And she says, well, you should know these things because they're going on. And I said, how do you know they're going on? She says, they showed the film of it on the internet. It had to have actually happened. And my response, didn't you see Jurassic Park? You know, a film today doesn't prove to you something has happened, you know? So the thing is, how much freedom should they have in producing things like that? How much freedom should people have in speaking? Like we all know, it's against the law to scream fire in a crowded building. Why don't I have the freedom to scream whatever I want? Don't be an idiot, okay? So this kind of thing is ongoing in courts and in every country I know of. They did not want everyone to have the right to vote, okay? It's interesting that initially, while they wanted all people to equal, they did not want people to have the right to vote. They thought that the middle class should have the strongest voice in government. Why the middle class? They thought the middle class represented the general thing of our country. And you know, that's really true. If you go back, there were very few really impoverished, and there were very few very wealthy. The bulk of our country was the middle class. So the middle class represented the country. But as a result of that, they were very suspicious of the privileged class and very suspicious of the lower class. I give you an example in my own life. I personally would like to see people take a test that would indicate they understood every proposition before they could vote on the proposition. That has nothing to do with who you vote for the different offices, but I would go in and I would take this short test, and they'd say, well, you understand the first 4 propositions, you don't understand this one, and you understand these. So you could vote on the ones you understood, okay? I think that'd be a good idea. So anyway, they believed that the upper classes were selfish and the lower classes were ignorant, and the middle classes could maintain a balance. I suspect that was written by members of the middle class, okay? But anyway, they saw this. They thought that the most important factor, we're talking liberals again, in increasing the wealth of a country was economic freedom, okay? Now that was something that really came with the United States. This is economic freedom. It's called in theology laissez-faire capitalism, where there's no restrictions on the earning of money and stuff like this. And we watch, I'm thinking of the age of things like the Vanderbilts and the Hearsts and the, the Fords, Firestone, Edison. These people were insanely wealthy. And a lot of them built monuments that will stand forever showing how much money they really had. But there were a lot of people who were very poor as a result of it too. Restrictions and regulations should be abolished, and the government should interfere in economic freedom as little as possible. And again, the problem here is defining what is as little as possible. An example would be, codes. If you decide you're going to put up a house in San Luis Obispo, it's a fortune in codes and all these things beforehand, before you ever build the house. And everyone complains about it. I don't think anyone likes it until we have an earthquake. And then it's very interesting that we will have, I think it was a 7 in Watsonville, but when they had the 7 in Watsonville, something like 3 people were killed with debris that was falling off the buildings. You have that same earthquake in some city in Mexico where people are building their houses out of adobe and stuff. You have thousands killed. And what's the difference? It's codes. So what we want to do is have people have economic freedom, but within limits again, okay? There have to be limits on freedom. I am also thinking about chemicals added to things, that we have laws like that just to protect people. They were also against any alliance between the church and state if it meant privileges. So the church and state could work together unless it meant privileges. And like when I was a child, in fact, when I was first ordained, the number of privileges that priests had was absolutely amazing. That as a priest, you never paid for services. So if you went to a doctor or a dentist, you were on a golf course or a gym or a massage or any kind of service, you never paid for. And, that isn't right. It isn't fair. But that's the way it was. So the alliance between the church and state can be fine, just as long as it doesn't lead to privileges. Many Roman Catholics wanted to reconcile Christianity with some of the basic ideas of liberalism, okay? Which is to use some religious principles as well about what you can print and what you can't, and that sort of stuff, okay? They wanted freedom of speech, worship, and the press. Many disliked the close relationship between the church and authoritarian governments. So, like for instance, I don't think anyone in the United States resents the Catholic Church in their relationship with our government, because it's no different. The Catholic Church is a huge organization in the United States, but if you were to take a little tiny church, independently founded by some pastor, and they have the same relationship with the government that we do, that they're all the same. So that's not the issue. However, you go into a place like Spain, and the church receives a percentage of the taxes taken from the people. There's salaries for the clergy, and all the churches are maintained by the government, all the Catholic churches, okay? And you go into Mexico, and in Mexico all the churches are maintained by the government too, okay? But they would maintain the churches of any religion. If you have a church, then they maintain it. So as long as there's no privilege, then people are fine. But as soon as you come to an authoritarian government, then there would be privileges for the religion of the one in charge. There's a man by the name of Felicitas de Lamenias, and he was a priest and a gifted writer who wanted church and education free of the government. Okay? Probably the most important tool with regards to people and everything is the ability to educate. And so they wanted the education to be free of the government. Oftentimes the government wanted education free of the church, but here he wanted free of the government. He founded a newspaper and gathered many brilliant liberals around him. He had strong support among the Catholic clergy in France. The Pope, however, condemned his views and he left the church. Now, remember in France, we'd seen the French Revolution, everything, and they have a parliamentary government and the rise of all these things. Well, in the church, there was a great fear of the Pope that we would end up with a parliamentary governance in the church and would lose the authority of the Pope and stuff. And one of the problems oftentimes is the church looks at movements in the world and imagines those movements within the church, okay? And the church has never been, nor will we ever be really, a democratic institution. That's just not what we are as an institution. And so the popes condemned this sort of thing in civil government. Belgium became a liberal country when it became independent. The Constitution provided freedom of worship, recognition of religious orders, papal appointment of the bishop. The king, Leopold I, was a Protestant, and his government included Catholics and Protestants. He was a true liberal. He was a Protestant, but a true liberal. His reign saw the building of many schools and the passages of many liberal laws, okay? But now remember, he's still a despot. He becomes king. It's just he's a liberal despot. So he brings in all these things. The Roman Catholic bishops of Belgium were suspicious of the moral and religious atmosphere of the state university and established a Catholic university in Louvain. And I should mention, Louvain is still one of the most important universities in the world. Their theology department is fantastic. We have many priests in the United States go for doctoral work in Louvain. To avoid offending the country's liberals, it was not a pontifical university under the control of Rome. A pontifical university, I graduated from a pontifical university, University of Ottawa, the St. Paul's University in Ottawa, Canada. And a pontifical university is directly under the authority of the Pope. So the Pope can look at let's say someone teaching theology in St. Paul's and say no, and that person has to leave. Now that isn't true in Louvain. In fact, there have been several people teaching theology there that the Pope would like to have gotten rid of, but that's just not the way Louvain runs. The Pope's concern that Louvain would become a center of Catholic liberalism proved actually to be groundless, okay? Although the rector and many of the professors were followers of Lamenitas, we mentioned earlier, it became and remains one of the great centers of Roman Catholic scholarship, okay? So it never, I think when you're talking about higher education, my experience is that when you're dealing with with higher education, period, higher education tends to be liberal, but it doesn't just produce liberals. So like when I studied at UC Berkeley, that education was very liberal. But everyone who graduates from Berkeley is not a liberal. It's just that at higher education, in my opinion, it tends to be liberal because you're looking at new ideas and all kinds of things. So it would be natural for it to be liberal. The idea behind the university was to provide a place to study the church's place in the new ideas and the new order of things and be free from anti-Catholic or anti-clerical attacks. So the church wants to now study these different things and see where is our place in liberalism and where's the place of liberalism in the church, because we have to live with it whether we like it or not. So how does that work? In Germany, the University of Tübingen had both a Catholic and a Protestant department of theology. Now, this is a university that was established by the government, Tübingen. However, I will tell you that this, like Louvain, Tübingen and Louvain are probably the most, Tübingen, Louvain, and the Sorbonne are the three most powerful Catholic universities in Europe. And they're just amazing places. And all of them have both Protestants and Catholics. And Louvain is a Catholic university. They have Protestant teachers. At the Pontifical University in Ottawa, where I studied, was the first time I'd ever had a Protestant professor teaching Protestant theology. It was the very first time, and it was in the Pontifical University. John Adam Moher taught that the church was a living organism and the life of Christ circulated through the church. Okay? Now, it's very common to look at societies as living organisms. And you can watch, like if you know how organisms grow and split and all this sort of thing, that you could take some, let me take England. Suppose England is a living organism, okay? In England as a living organism spread to Canada, to the United States, Australia, New Zealand, India, okay? Over a period of time, we each became independent. But the United States and Canada are different from one another, and both of them different from England, okay? And if you go into Australia and New Zealand, I would say that Australia is probably one of the most liberal societies in the whole world, and New Zealand is one of the most conservative. But they're both children of England, okay? And so what we watched, you can look at it as a living, growing organism, and that's how he looked at it. He says the church was in a constant state of growth, and doctrine, though not something fixed, helped people to walk in the footsteps of Christ. Church tradition was really the Word of God living in the faithful. And that's what we hold when we talk today in the church about Scripture and tradition. Tradition is how the faithful look at everything and have learned to look at everything over a period of time as just part of the ongoing practice of the faith. And it's curious, again, if you study it historically, the church looked at all of this stuff very different when we began, and our opposite, or our persecutors, were the Jews. And in the next period of history, our persecutors were the government, and the Jews were as persecuted as we were under them. And so the forming of the community is very, very different at one time or another. Today, no Catholic would see the Jews as an enemy. Today, no Catholic would see most governments as an enemy of the church. We certainly see atheism that spreads in many of the governments as an enemy of the church. But mainly we see despotism as the enemy of the church. Because as soon as you have a tyrant who's in charge of a country, they will not accept criticism. And one of the purposes of religion, just religion, is to speak the truth to government, okay? And oftentimes government doesn't want to hear the truth. Friedrich Schleiermacher, a Protestant, stressed the importance of religion in the intellectual and cultural life of humanity. He worked out a brand new system of theology, with the starting point being the inner feel of dependence, which leads people to God. So he began theology studying what is there about people that leads them to God and to this development. You see, our starting point is revelation, that God spoke to Abraham. And so we start off with this body of stuff. He starts out with the interior thing of the person. And you can't help but look at religion and see it's formed by both. It's formed by both all the time. So you can start out on either one. But he was the first one to really use the starting point, what I would call the need for God. He was the first one to do that as a starting point. Both Moller and Schleiermacher tried to relate their faith to the needs and realities of the time. Okay? So one guy comes out of the theological background we have. One guy starts out with people, but they're doing the same thing with religion. They did not find any support among the more conservative members of the different faiths, but their ideas were mild in the light of what was going to follow in the next few generations. 1798. After a failed rebellion, Ireland was forced into union with Great Britain. Scottish and English Protestants had settled in Ulster, the northern province of Ireland, and under the entrance into Great Britain, the Scottish and English Protestants enjoyed very, very special privileges. These privileges extended to all the Protestants in Ireland. To be non-Catholic in Ireland gave you very, very special privileges. Catholics had been stripped of the right to participate in politics and their land holdings as well, and were being forced to pay tithes to support the Protestant Church of Ireland. Okay? The Church of England is known in Ireland as the Church of Ireland. Okay? And so as in Canada, it's known as the United Church of Canada. And the Catholics were forced to support that. The vast majority of people of Ireland were Catholic. Maynooth Seminary had been opened in 1795. Now notice it's 1798 where they are forced to join Britain. In 1795, Maynooth Seminary had been opened, and native religious congregations like the Irish Brothers, Christian Brothers, were very, very active. The clergy were close to the people, and the Catholic faith was central to the life of the people. We'll watch. You see, the faith in Ireland is very close to the people, largely because the clergy, the Catholic Church in Ireland is defined by your parish clergy, okay? The Catholic Church in France was defined by the bishops, who were considered a royal order. So when the government was overthrown, the church suffered terribly because it was overthrown with it. In Ireland, not so much, because the church was not sure of the people. The same thing happened in Mexico. In Mexico, there are many governments that have tried to really root out the church. But the essence of the church in Mexico is the parish priests, not the bishops. It is the parish priests. In this same year of the revolt, a young man, Daniel O'Connell, became a lawyer in Ireland, and he worked for the restoration of the political rights of Catholics, and he founded a Catholic organization to work for this goal. In 1828, the law excluding Catholics from being elected was repealed, and he was elected to Parliament in London. Now remember, because they become part of Great Britain, their Parliament doesn't meet in Ireland. Their Parliament meets in London. Another law, however, forbade his taking seat in Parliament. So there was a law in England that wouldn't let him sit in Parliament, but the law in Ireland allowed him to be elected to Parliament. You could see there was trouble brewing. In 1829, the Catholic Emancipation Bill removed most restrictions against Roman Catholics. O'Connell became the first Catholic Lord Mayor of London, and since 1885, and as the British would outlaw organizations, he would organize another. So, like for instance, he would organize these organizations to promote the Irish against the English. He would set up the organization. The British would outlaw it. He'd simply start another organization. It would go on. He famously tried through legal means to solve the problems between London and Ireland. He was a brilliant lawyer and a great speaker. He could move crowds and stuff. 1830, in the University of Oxford, they began a study of the origins of the Church of England, and it became known as the Oxford Movement. One of the things that had gone on through the history was the fact that when the Church of England broke off from Rome, the real authority in England was the king. And this did not matter much under Henry VIII. It mattered immensely under Queen Elizabeth. When Queen Elizabeth came in, she started appointing certain priests as bishops. And she's the one who appointed and basically had the ceremony that made them bishops. And at that point, the Catholic Church believed that holy orders, the power of priesthood, no longer passed in the English Church. And so what they wanted to do in England was study the early church. Like when you study the early church, you discover that there are a lot of small communities, like in Paul, that are very different from one another, that he starts out, and they all seem to have some kind of independence. But when you begin to go in to the study in the most ancient thing, you'll find that while they have kind of an independence, if they have a problem they can't solve, they refer it to the Pope. That's way back in history, in the early days, long before Constantine. They would refer these problems to the Pope, so that there was strong papal authority right from the very beginning. As a result of that, when the Oxford movement began to set this up they were trying to prove the validity of orders in the Catholic Church. The idea was to prove apostolic origins for the Church of England, free the Church from the government control, and renew the spiritual life of the people. That this movement was opposed by Parliament and by the press, but it succeeded in bringing much more ceremony into worship, reestablishing religious orders. So the Anglican Church has their own religious orders now. They were reestablished at this time, and involved people in more care for people in the slums. So that this movement, Parliament did not like the movement. They were perfectly happy with the idea of the king being head of the church, and that was the whole thing. You didn't need to establish it. That's just the way it was. But this movement began to look into that. The leader of the movement was one of the most famous religious leaders in the history of England, and he was John Henry Newman. He was an Anglican clergyman, and he was one of the founders of the Oxford movement. He is perhaps one of the greatest prose writers and wrote many pamphlets for the movement and became a famous preacher. He's just a remarkable man. His books are still very, very meaningful about how he eventually became a Catholic, how he became a Catholic and a cardinal. And I think you know that on Catholic universities throughout the world, there are organizations for Catholic students. They're called the Newman Clubs, and they're named after this John Henry Newman. His study of the church fathers led him to become a Catholic. He was ordained a Catholic priest, eventually made a cardinal. The autobiography of his intellectual life and conversion to the Catholic Church is considered a classic of English literature. It's one of the great books of English literature, whether you believe in the Catholic Church or anything. And the title of the book is Apologia Pro Vita Sua. And apology in Latin means an explanation. So it's really an explanation of my life. Apologia Pro Vita Sua. Okay? In the 1800s, in the United States, a movement called nativism began as a response to the huge influx of Roman Catholics. I hope you remember that when we started this, we mentioned that there were not a lot of Roman Catholics in the States when it started. There were some Irish and some German, but not a lot of Roman Catholics in the United States. In the areas outside the United States, there were a lot. There were a lot of Roman Catholics in the Louisiana area, but they didn't become part of the states till the Louisiana Purchase and went in. And there were a lot of Roman Catholics in the Spanish West, but they wouldn't be included in the country till the country moved west and we became states. So at this time now, Catholic immigrants began to come into the Northeast. And one of the problems we watch in politics, one of the most frightening things to people in politics is when the demographics begin to change. Like, for instance, in California, there are a lot of people terrified by the huge influx of Hispanics. At the time of the gold rush, they were terrified by the huge influx of Chinese. And I mean, we could just go through these things at different times. The thing is that once they come in with their own culture and customs, everything, but they eventually disappear into the culture. It's amazing. One of the old customs from Spain that came to the United States is called the quinceañera. And at the age of about 15, a girl would have a quinceañera. It looks very much like a wedding. And it marks her official beginning to date with regards to marriage. And as part of it, she has 2 godparents, and those godparents are responsible to chaperone every date until she is married, okay? And so you have this thing set up. But it's very interesting in the United States today that most young ladies of the Spanish Mexican background will have a quinceañera. But more often than not, it's in English. And God help one of those godparents who tries to go on a date with them. I mean, it's a very different thing now. But it came in as Spanish customs, and that happens in the United States. These customs come in, and they sort of go into the society. And they're nothing really to fear. In fact, they're what makes the United States the United States. In 1815, there were 150,000 Catholics in the United States. But by 1860, there were 3 million. The people, again, were still largely from Germany and Ireland. They did not expect any support from the government, because in Germany, the government was Lutheran, and in Ireland, the government was Anglican. So these early Catholics were actually the American ideal. They expected nothing from the government. They expected this complete independence. Bishop John England of Charleston taught that total separation of the church from the state was the most natural and secure condition for the church. We'll stop here, but I'd like to say a little more about that before we go. It's interesting that if you begin to study a lot of papal writing around this time, that the Pope is constantly writing to the American bishops to try and get the United States to become a Catholic country and in with the government, all this sort of thing. And the bishops are constantly writing to him, we are best this way. We're independent of the government. The government isn't telling us what to do. We don't tell the government what to do. And in the United States, the Catholic Church, as we know it today, flourished because of our independence from the government. We have never done as well anywhere as we've done in the United States. And the church has flourished and built, and that's true of all religions in the United States. To the degree we respect one another and are free from the government and influence, we are free to be the church that we feel called to be, and end up working very, very well. And eventually, you watch the church really fosters today democratic governments. And the church doesn't, like if you were to look in the Philippines, the church did not support Marcos. Marcos supported the church, and he was very into it, but the church was not pro-Marcos. And when you have these despots, even if they're pro-Catholic, they don't end up good for us. They don't end up good for anyone. So anyway, we'll pick this up, and we're watching the church now develop in what's known as the Great Experiment, how we do under a democratic government. Thank you very much.